At 73, Margaret Eleanor Hartwell had weathered more storms than most people see in 2 lifetimes. But nothing had prepared her for the sting of mockery from someone she'd welcomed into her family with open arms. Standing at 5 feet, 2 inches with silver hair that she kept neatly styled in a gentle wave, Margaret possessed the kind of quiet dignity that comes from decades of putting others before herself. Her blue eyes, though now framed by laugh lines and the inevitable marks of time, still held the sharp intelligence that had once made her one of the most respected elementary school principals in Cedar Falls. For 35 years, Margaret had dedicated her life to shaping young minds, arriving at Lincoln Elementary before dawn, and staying long after the last child was picked up. She'd used her own modest salary to buy supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them, kept granola bars in her desk drawer for the hungry ones, and spent countless evenings visiting parents to discuss their children's progress. Her colleagues often joked that Margaret cared more about her students than she did about herself, a truth that extended far beyond the classroom walls. When her husband Robert passed away unexpectedly at 58, Margaret had been faced with an impossible choice. Her son Daniel was just starting his junior year at State University, struggling with pre-med courses and drowning in student debt. Without hesitation, she'd cashed in her retirement savings and taken a second job at the local library to ensure Daniel could finish his education without the crushing burden of loans. She'd worn the same 3 interview suits for 5 years, mended sweaters until they were more patches than original fabric, and learned to find joy in simple pleasures: a cup of tea on her back porch, phone calls with old friends, and the satisfaction of watching Daniel graduate summa cum laude. Margaret's sacrifices had extended well into Daniel's medical residency. When he'd called, exhausted and barely able to afford groceries on his residence salary, she'd quietly sent money from her already stretched pension. When he'd met Clarissa, a pediatric nurse from a wealthy family in the suburbs, Margaret had been thrilled. Finally, her son had found someone who could appreciate his dedication and perhaps share the burden of supporting him through his training. The wedding had been everything Margaret had dreamed of: elegant, joyful, and filled with promise for the future. She'd spent months hunting for the perfect mother-of-the-groom dress, finally settling on a lovely navy blue ensemble from J.C. Penney that made her feel confident and appropriate for the occasion. Clarissa had seemed genuinely warm then, thanking Margaret repeatedly for raising such a wonderful man and promising to take good care of him. 3 years later, Dr. Daniel Hartwell was thriving in his pediatric practice, living in a beautiful, suburban home with his wife and their 2 young children, Margaret's precious grandchildren, Emma and Lucas. Margaret had assumed her relationship with Clarissa would naturally evolve into the kind of close bond she'd always hoped to have with a daughter. Instead, she'd found herself walking on eggshells, never quite understanding why her attempts at closeness seemed to create distance. The turning point had come during last month's family barbecue at Daniel and Clarissa's home. Margaret had arrived, wearing her favorite summer outfit, a floral blouse from Walmart and comfortable khaki pants from Target, clothes that were clean, appropriate, and perfectly suitable for a casual family gathering. She'd been helping Clarissa set the table when she'd overheard her daughter-in-law on the phone with a friend in the kitchen. "Oh, God, you should see what Margaret's wearing today," Clarissa had whispered, thinking Margaret was still outside. "It's like she shops exclusively at discount stores. I mean, I know teachers don't make much, but she's retired now. Couldn't she at least try to look like she belongs in our neighborhood? It's honestly embarrassing when the neighbors see her." The words had hit Margaret like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her frozen in the dining room with a stack of plates in her trembling hands. For a moment, she'd wanted to march into that kitchen and remind Clarissa exactly who had made it possible for Daniel to become the successful doctor he was today, exactly whose discount store sacrifices had paved the way for their comfortable life. Instead, Margaret had quietly finished setting the table, smiled through dinner, and spent the drive home wondering if love and sacrifice would ever be enough to earn respect from the woman her son had chosen to spend his life with. But as she'd lain awake that night, Something had shifted inside Margaret Hartwell. If Clarissa thought her mother-in-law's clothes were the problem, perhaps it was time to show her just how wrong she could be. After all, Margaret had learned a long time ago that sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The question that had kept her awake wasn't whether she should respond to Clarissa's cruelty. It was how far she was willing to go to make her point.